Hello, everyone. We might get underway here, and if further people come, they can join in. So it gives me a lot of pleasure to be here today. My name's Ben, and to be introducing Michelle, who's going to be talking about the research that she's done over the last 4 years or so. As everyone knows in the room, it's not been an easy time to do something like a PhD. So Michelle first had issues with drought and bushfire, and then subsequently COVID and shutdown and trying to have access. So Michelle's project was field-based, a lot of field work, all outside the ACT. So leaving the jurisdiction was tricky, and the challenges with COVID and then subsequently flooding also made it hard to access sites in 2022. So Michelle's had the whole range of challenges thrown at her, but has come through and produced really nice work. It's on work, as you can see, on frogs and amphibian conservation within farmland. And so I'll hand over to Michelle now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle, for those of you that have never met me. Today, firstly, thank you, Ben. I'll be presenting my final PhD seminar on frogs in farm dams, and I will be supported by my supervisors, Ben, David, and John. Now, before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and the land on which I conducted my research. So today we meet on Ngunnawal Ngambri land, and my research was carried out on Wiradjuri country. I acknowledge the elders past, present, and future. Their country is beautiful and wonderful, and sovereignty was never ceded. But let's get this started. Great. So today's seminar, it's going to run very simply. First, we'll do a quick little background of why I did my research. Then we'll run through each of my 4 chapters, and from there, I will touch briefly on some conclusions, give a quick thanks to my dog, and when we have time at the end, we'll do a quick Q&A. So, why have I spent the last 4 years of my life researching frogs in farm dams, and why should those of you here with us today care? Well, one simple reason: frogs are really, really important. Amphibians have high ecological value. Much of this is believed to be due to the role they play as ecological indicators or bioindicators. In having highly porous skin as both tadpoles and adults, they are highly sensitive to changes in their environment and will avoid environments that are overly fragmented or in poor condition. Amphibians play a pivotal role in ecosystems as secondary consumers in many food chains. Tadpoles have significant impact in nutritional cycling, while both adults and tadpoles are preyed upon by a large number of vertebrates, such as birds, turtles, and fish. Adult amphibians are also biological pest controllers, meaning that they have been recorded consuming pest species and reducing the need for pesticides while doing no further damage to crops. So, while we acknowledge that frogs are really, really important, we also have to acknowledge that they are one of the most threatened groups on the planet. In recent decades, we have seen a significant decline in amphibian populations, with 41% of all amphibian species facing the threat of decline or extinction worldwide. And this is typically a result of threats such as disease, habitat loss, or climate change. However, one of the leading causes of these declines are the conversions of habitat to agricultural land. Primarily, this damage is caused through the large-scale conversion of aquatic and terrestrial habitat into cropping and grazing country, which becomes more of an issue with the increase of large monocultures as opposed to the more traditional farming practices. We have the use of chemicals such as pesticides. These can drift long distances and often end up in our waterways. And then finally, the introduction of hard-hooved livestock such as cattle. They introduce nutrients into the soils and waterways through their feces. The overstocking of cattle often leads to compaction and degradation of soil, and often removes and damages vital habitat and food sources. But fortunately, we also have seen the construction of novel and artificial habitats, and that some species have been able to adjust to quite well, either through phenotypic plasticity or microevolutionary responses to natural selection. Some really well-known examples of this are rice paddies throughout Asia, where we see frogs, beetles, and other microinvertebrates take up residence. Then we have cities where a number of species, especially birds, have been taking up residence. And in some cases, so if you think of like your common pigeons, they are choosing to remain in these artificial habitats over the naturally occurring ones. And then finally, we have a lesser studied addition to the list, and that is farm dams. And farm dams are what you all know I have investigated in relation to frogs and how they can and do use them. All right. So chapter 1, the ecological and biodiversity conservation values of farm dams, a systematic review. This chapter, we decided that rather than looking at farm dams on their own, or farm dams with frogs on their own, we would be looking at farm dams and the habitat value they have for all creatures. This would give us a greater understanding of what is happening in farm dams globally. So for this paper, we asked 3 questions. First, we asked what other researchers are focusing on within their research. What groups of biota are being studied? So not just frogs, but all groups. This was partly because there's just not enough research out there of frogs in farm dams, but also, and sort of to a lesser extent, we wanted to know what other groups were being studied, more or less, and if so, like why? And finally, we wanted to know what are the key factors influencing biodiversity in farm dams across the world. In doing this and in getting these answers, I was hoping that I could implement some of these findings into later chapters of my thesis. All right, so in asking these questions, my team and I screened over 6,000 articles that met our search terms. And after a lot of reading, we narrowed that down to 104 articles that looked at our specific definition of farm dams and their habitat value. From here, we divided those into 2 categories based on their primary goal or their research question. Ecological studies were typically those that looked at the biodiversity habitat value of farm dams for ecological purposes. So, for example, how a species would use those bodies for breeding. While production studies were those that examined agricultural production in response to biodiversity, relevant variables. So, for example, how water quality of a dam could be used or how it would have an impact on livestock weight. This research spanned across 27 countries, with countries such as the United States, Spain, and Japan playing significant roles in the current research. However, lower economic countries would fall behind. From there, we further broke down our studies into their primary focus, which was very commonly species richness, water quality, and vegetation cover, as well as their focal study taxa. These were very frequently macroinvertebrates, macrophytes, and amphibians. Cool. So the takeaway. First, obviously, the body of work is very small, very limited. Thankfully, we are seeing an increasing trend in the number of studies looking at farm dams quite significantly in the last few years as well. So even though we were able to divide the studies up into ecological and production focuses, there was very limited cross-collaboration between these 2, with only 1 of the 104 studies looking at both the ecological and agricultural outcomes of dams. Of all the studies, there were no terrestrial groups studied. I'm actually not sure why, but as I said before, the majority of the studies focused on macroinvertebrates, macrophytes, and amphibians, with the rest looking at groups such as birds and fish and algae. But I am hoping that with this increase of interest, we'll start getting some sort of answers to what's going on with terrestrial animals in this space. However, while they weren't looking at terrestrial animals, there were quite a few papers that looked at threatened species and found some very interesting results showing that dams were actually able to support threatened species and that there is a potential for them to be really important for these species. And then finally, but not surprisingly, habitat quality and presence was the most important factor across the board for biodiversity in farm dams and the value that these dams have as habitat. Cool. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, we have the management to enhance farm dams. A farm dam condition improves outcomes for amphibians. In my head, this was the paper. This was the whole reason I did my PhD. I was very, very excited about this paper. To this day, this paper is still the most, like, my favorite paper that I've ever published. And I don't know, I hope you enjoy it. I think it gets some very interesting results. So with this chapter, we aimed to broaden our understanding of frogs in agricultural landscapes, and specifically how frogs use farm dams and how dams can be managed to increase the occurrence and abundance of frogs in these landscapes. In order to do this, we asked one really big mouthful of a question. And that was, how do amphibian presence / absence, richness and abundance respond to dam management, so enhanced versus control dams, dam characteristics, and landscape context. All right. So one major, or the major component of this study was to look at the difference between enhanced dams and control dams. The dams we refer to as control dams, they are your business as usual dam, your run-of-the-mill, everyday farm dam that the average person would think of when I say farm dam. Most of these are in paddocks that are either set or rotationally stocked with cattle or sheep, and they are typically left as they are. We then have enhanced dams. These are dams that have been fenced either fully or partially from stock and other management activities. In most cases, they have additional vegetation put in as well. The specifics of the vegetation we've left to the discretion of the land holder. However, they are given advice from sustainable farms as well as land care. And the general idea of enhanced dams was to give farmers their own way of contributing to the conservation of their property, while also contributing positively to their enterprise and the connectivity across the landscape as a whole. Cool. Right, so this is a really great example of enhancing a farm dam. This dam in particular is located in Walla Walla, New South Wales. And as you can see here, back in December 2019, it was just your standard run-of-the-mill hole in the ground. And then after, or over 2 years, it changed quite dramatically and is actually a very successful, wonderful hole in the ground now with lots of frogs, lots of tadpoles. It's alive and beautiful and a perfect example of what an enhanced dam should be. So in order to get a greater understanding of why the frogs are at these dams, we measured a number of variables that we broke down into site scale and then landscape scale variables. Our site scale variables consisted of vegetation cover, so the percentage of riparian, aquatic, and terrestrial vegetation. We also had vegetation complexity, which was the sum of all the different vegetation types at a site. We also included water quality, so that was total dissolved solids, pH, dissolved oxygen, and turbidity. All of which we were hypothesizing would coincide with whether or not the dams were fenced. And then at the landscape scale, variables included connectivity, so distance to dense woody vegetation. And by that, we mean a clump of trees, a clump of vegetation, as opposed to just a standalone paddock tree. And then we also included distance to another permanent water body. Now that could include a dam or a lake or a river, another pond, as long as it was another permanent incised water body. And finally, we also included water cover across the landscape. And this was topographic wetness index within the 5-kilometer radius of the dams. Lovely. All right, so in order to collect this data, we did repeat surveys in spring and summer of 2020 and 2021. We would go out each night at around, as soon as the sun set, and start the night with a 10-minute call survey from the dam wall, where we recorded individual male calling and then their species. We would then follow that up with a 15-minute visual survey of frogs and tadpoles along the water's edge. This was typically done by walking around the perimeter of the dam with a handheld or a head torch and looking for any signs of frogs. During this, we counted any individuals and then recorded their species. Earlier in the day, we would head out and we would record environmental predictor variables. These were the ones from the last slide, so vegetation and water quality. And then we would also measure and record local weather conditions, including cloud cover, rain, wind speed, etc. Now, these survey methods were used both by myself and by the Sustainable Farms team, who actually did all the surveys for me in Victoria, as this all occurred during border closures. So I physically couldn't get to Victoria, so the Sustainable Farms team did me a real solid this one. All right, so before we actually get to the results, we have some quick stats for you. We surveyed a total of 85 dams across 29 farms. 45 of those dams were enhanced and 40 were controlled. We recorded 5,987 individual frogs, with those being broken up into 10 relatively common species. The species we found the most were Crinia signifera, Limnodynastes tasmaniensis, and Littoria perroni. This little fellow here is Limnodynastes interioris, or a banjo frog. I just think he's really cool, so needed to include him in this slide. Cool. So now for our results. Just quickly, before I go into these, just a quick and dirty rundown of how to read this. Essentially, anything on the left-hand side of the dotted line is a negative, or will have a negative impact on frogs, and anything on the right-hand side is a positive impact. Any of the variables with a large circle are a significant impact, while the ones with a small circle did have an impact, however, that wasn't significant. So you can see here for total frog abundance, aquatic vegetation, average daily rainfall, and enhanced dams on their own all had a significant positive impact on the abundance of frogs. So how many frogs were there? And then total dissolved solids within the water, so poor water quality, had a significant negative impact on the total number of frogs at a site. With regards to species richness, although we didn't get a lot of results for species richness, and we didn't see a significant result for enhanced dams still had a positive impact on the species richness, and brown vegetation in particular had a significant positive impact on species richness. So this means we saw more species of frogs at dams that had a higher vegetation right up to the water body and then back to the dam wall. In regards to our individual species presence, you can see that there's a lot of variation. There aren't that many patterns among the individual species. These are all common species, so we sort of expect that. However, we can see a trend that total dissolved solids within the water has a negative impact. So again, we are seeing less individuals of these species present at dams with poor water quality. And then finally, these individual species abundance. So how many of these species or how many of these individuals were at the dams? You can see again, there's a lot of variability among the species. But again, turbidity has a negative impact on the abundance of these individual species, and year had a positive impact, which essentially meant I saw more frogs in the second year than the first one. Great, cool. So what can we take away from this paper? Firstly, a very broad statement. Enhanced dams are improving habitat for common frog species in agricultural landscapes. While overall enhanced dams had a greater abundance and greater occurrence of most species, even though it wasn't significant for all of the different response variables. Unfortunately, that means that we do still need to be doing more research in the space. We need a comprehensive conservation approach that involves the inclusion of landholders, researchers, and organizations. It also means looking for not just enhancing dams on their own, but seeing how we can further enhance these dams and potentially looking at other alternatives on top of enhancing dams. Additionally, we need to look at other threats such as chytrid disease, invasive species, climate change, and drought, and how we can address those in conservation management of frogs across agricultural landscapes. Lovely. Moving on to chapter 3. Enhancing farm dams increases tadpole abundance. So for this paper, we had 2 questions. First, we asked, are there differences in tadpole abundance and growth between farm dams that have been enhanced and those that have not? And then from there, we asked, what are the factors that contribute to the differences in tadpole abundance and growth within these 2 dam types? Similar to the first paper, we looked at control dams and enhanced dams. However, the big difference with this study was that it was only conducted in spring 2021 because Victoria had hard lockdowns and no one was leaving anything. So it was just New South Wales for this one. Again, we looked at the same predictor variables as the adult paper, those being vegetation cover, water quality, connectivity, and water cover across the landscape. And for these surveys, I completed 2 per season at both the enhanced dams and the control dams. However, unlike the adult surveys, these were done during the daytime, usually during the warmest time of the day when tadpoles are most active. I would dip net for tadpoles at the cardinal points of the dams, so the most north, south, east, and west. And this was to avoid habitat bias during the surveys. Any caught individuals were identified at the genus level, and I would guesstimate their Gosner stage, which is their stage of development, record their length, and then return them to the water. These surveys were done on the same day as the adult surveys. So we would, we also use the adult presence data as predictor variable, as well as the same environment and weather data that was collected that day. Right. So again, some more quick stats. This time we only had 52 dams, 28 were enhanced, 24 were controlled, and these were across 18 farms. We were only able to record 198 individuals across 3 groups. And unlike the frogs, it's quite difficult to identify individual species at the tadpole level. So instead we divided them into the genus, and we got these 3 main species, or these 3 main groups. So we had Crinia, Limnodynastes, and Littoria. So even though we didn't find large quantities of individuals, we did get some pretty interesting results. You can see here that we have an increase or predicted increase of tadpole abundance with increasing dissolved oxygen, with the presence of Limnodynastes adults and riparian vegetation, while we also see a decrease in abundance with an increase in pH in the water. Additionally, we see a decrease of the probability of 0 individuals with an increase of adult presence. Or to phrase that differently, tadpoles are more likely to occur at sites where there were adults. And then additionally, we had a higher probability of 0 individuals occurring at control dams. Or again, we were more likely to see tadpoles at enhanced dams. That was quite to the extent where we only actually found 2 tadpoles in any of the control dams. And then we saw some really interesting results and interactions between Gambusia holbrooki and tadpoles. We didn't originally plan on recording Gambusia. However, for any of you that are unfamiliar, Gambusia holbrooki, or eastern mosquito fish, are pains in the ass. They're massive pest species. If you are out in a water body with a net, they will be out there with you, and good luck avoiding them. So we found, well, Gambusia, they prey on tadpoles. So they're well known for preying on spawn and small tadpole species. So we weren't surprised when we saw this relationship. We see a negative relationship between the presence of Gambusia and the growth of tadpoles. So you can see here that in the sites where Gambusia were absent, tadpoles were larger and they were further along in their development. Lovely. All right. So what did we get from this study? Fortunately, we found even though that the tadpoles were occurring in really small numbers, farm dams are actually important, or could potentially be important for their breeding. Again, while we didn't find any tadpoles in control dams and the relationships between enhanced dams and tadpole presence wasn't overly significant, the significance lied within the habitat and the water quality that these enhanced dams created, meaning that water quality and vegetation cover, regardless of the site, is important for tadpoles. Again, Gambusia holbrooki, they're not going anywhere. They will remain a threat for tadpoles forever. Especially while they're in smaller numbers. Potentially when we get larger numbers of tadpoles within these sites, the threat will become lesser, but at this stage, they're still going to remain quite a significant threat. And then obviously, like most studies, this was 2 surveys over 1 season. More studies, more results, more interesting finds. Okay. And then lastly, we have chapter 4. This is amphibian, temporal, and spatial patterns across agricultural landscapes of the southeast New South Wales. So with this paper, we had already looked at farm dams as a whole, as a standalone, and how they impact many different species or creatures. We then looked at adult frogs in farm dams and tadpoles in farm dams. With this paper, we wanted to look at what amphibians were doing as a whole across the landscape, regardless of what type of habitat it was. In order to do that, we asked 3 questions. First, how did the habitat characteristics and climatic factors shape amphibian populations in agricultural landscapes? From there, we wanted to look at the temporal dynamics of amphibian populations in the southwest slopes of New South Wales. And then we followed that up by asking which habitat features are essential for the persistence of amphibians in these highly modified landscapes. So this paper differed from the other 2 in really significant ways. Firstly, it was a long-term study looking at population dynamics across 14 years. And I can math, 14 years, 2000 to 2021 is 21 years, not 14. However, data wasn't collected every single year, just due to poor weather conditions or access difficult issues and that sort of stuff. Secondly, this paper wasn't looking at just dams. While they were included as part of microhabitat, they were not the main focus. These surveys were done across the landscape as a whole and included different habitat types such as rocks and trees, fence lines, roads, logs, all that sort of stuff. However, fortunately, the predictor variables were very similar to the ones used in my previous papers. We still wanted to know what habitat frogs are using and how the water across the landscape impacted them. We wanted to know whether or not climate played a role, and then obviously if there are any changes over time. Naturally, being 8 when this paper started, I was not involved in the field surveys. So the data was collected by Sustainable Farms and the Lindenmeyer Lab across the 20 years. Surveys were conducted across 1 hectare areas, searching both natural and artificial habitats. However, they weren't actually looking for frogs specifically. The frog data collected during this was incidental. On-ground data was collected in real time, including temperature, any current rain conditions that were occurring, vegetation. And then we also had desktop level variables, including annual rainfall, topographic wetness index, and any water bodies within the landscape. Very bold of me to put a picture of myself in this paper when I didn't collect any of the data. Here we go. So across the 20 years, they had 218 sites. They did 3,610 surveys and found over 700,000 individuals. Of these individuals, most of them were quite common, but only 7 species were recorded in high enough quantities that we could actually include them in the analysis. So I'm not going to lie, this is a lot of data. It's a very big data set, and I have not finished analyzing it yet. So this is what we have so far, so bear with me. In regards to species richness, so how many different types of species are at these sites, we found that dams had a significant positive impact, as well as other habitat such as logs, rocks, and soils. More species are more commonly found at sites in close proximity to water bodies. And there is also a greater species richness in years with higher rainfall, where the topographic wetness index was also higher. The results become a little wild when we look at total abundance. We still see a positive correlation between dams and some other habitat types, as well as positive relationships between topographic wetness index and water bodies or sites near water bodies. However, things get a little bit interesting with some of the other habitat types. I'm not going to claim that I know why, but I will eventually. Oh, no, there we go. All right, so what can we take? Excuse me, there we go. So what can we take from this massive data set? Well, firstly, long-term monitoring is really, really important. Long-term monitoring always has been and always will be really important for ecological studies. It shows things such as trends over time and potential correlations that short-term monitoring simply can't. Looking at these results in particular, we can see that just watching and observing isn't enough. We actually have to actively go out and address these changes in land use, agriculture intensification, and climate variability. Although I didn't put it in today's presentation, there is quite a significant variability among the 7 species that were recorded, which potentially explains the wild abundance result, but we'll see. But essentially the takeaway is one size doesn't fit all. This means that unfortunately, we're going to need to find multiple management approaches to fit each of these multiple species. And it's unfortunately not going to be an easy task. And then lastly, even though we know that frogs are declining in significant numbers, all is not lost. They're out there, they're doing their thing. They might be out there in really small numbers, but they are using these landscapes and we are seeing them come back. We are seeing an increasing trend over the years that they are occurring in larger numbers, which is a bit exciting and means that we should continue to actively manage for the conservation of these species. Yeah, and that's my 4 papers. So what can I conclude, or what are the conclusions that I've come to from these 4 papers? I'm going to keep it really short because I don't want death by PowerPoint for me. And we've only got 2 major conclusions. So hopefully after today, you can remember at least one of those conclusions and be proud of yourself for learning one thing about our froggy friends. First thing is enhanced dams. They're an important management tool for conservation in landscapes, period. They're important. Even though enhanced dams on their own didn't prove to be significant in every single example, the habitat they created and the security they provided for these groups is enough to justify the creation of this novel and artificial habitat. They have proven time and time again to be useful and effective, not just for ecology and for production, but also for the mental health of landholders and their families. I don't know, personally, I would congratulate any landholder that has enhanced their dams. And if asked, I would highly recommend that any other landholders do the same. And then finally, my last conclusion is balance. Future research needs to focus on finding a balance between agricultural management and biodiversity conservation. We are at a point now that it's too late for us to just decide, pick one and go forward. We need to be concentrating on both of them at the same time. Additionally, collaboration between researchers, government agencies, and landholders is super important. Landholders can't be expected to do it all on their own. And there just simply isn't enough funding for government agencies and researchers to do it on their own either. And also, surprisingly, I don't actually know a single landholder that would be overly happy if the government just rocked up at their place and started fencing off their dams for the sake of the environment. Life has time again and again proven that we need to work together to achieve our goals, especially in these landscapes that are forever changing, and especially when it comes to conservation. And that's it. That's it. So thank you for being here. Thank you for spending your time with me. Don't worry, I haven't finished. Because it is the end of an era, end of 4 years, I have a number of people that I would like to thank for putting up with me over the last 4 years. So sit back, buckle up, it's going to be a ride. Firstly, my sponsors, Sustainable Farms, the Ecological Society of Australia, and the ANU. Sustainable Farms in particular, not only did they fund me and have been there with me and provided me with their data, the field staff put up with a lot of my crap. They put up with me crashing a ute into a fence. They came out with me late at night. They collected data for me, but they also fostered these really amazing relationships with the landholders. And that says a lot, because this little pink-haired girl would rock up at their farm at 1 a.m. with a torch and they would just let me go. And then unfortunately, some of them had to come and find me at 1 a.m. when I got lost. So Sustainable Farms have done an amazing job at fostering these relationships, and I could not be more grateful. My supervisors, Ben, David, and John, the patience that these men have, I swear to God. My ability to ask for help is about as good as my ability to breathe on the moon is. I'm so stubborn and I'm so independent. I'd rather sabotage myself than come to these men for help or go to anyone for help. They saw me through lockdowns and losses in my family, mental health breakdowns, burnouts, and my outright refusal to leave my home office. They also saw me through the disaster of my mysterious 5th paper that we will not talk about. And the fact that I don't know how I actually have the brain cells to do a PhD, let alone get this far, and they still persisted through. Well, I'm forever grateful to all 3 of you. Thank you so much. My mentors, only one of them is pictured up there, but we have Joe, Steph, and Beck. It's incredibly important for me to have strong female role models in STEM, and these women have given me advice and held my hands and all that sort of stuff, which is fantastic, but they're actually on ground out there leading the way in their specialty. Beck is out there killing it in far southwest New South Wales. Joe's out there playing with frogs, and Steph's killing it here with water. And it's just wonderful to have someone in STEM motivate me through this entire experience. It's wonderful. My friends and family, most of which actually don't know what I do. They know I'm the crazy frog person. They know I go out at nighttime and do crazy frog things. They know that I don't go to any of their events and I've missed all of their milestones, but they don't care. They're still there to support me and love me, and it's very sweet and very cute. And I appreciate every single one of them. This is a bit left of field and a bit strange, but bear with me. The queer and performing arts community, especially that in Canberra, Not a lot of people in this room, apologies to my supervisors that I have not told. I am a local drag and burlesque performer, and I have been performing around Canberra and Australia and winning many awards for many, many years. And in the last 4 years, I have developed a frog act where I have been going around Australia and doing a call to arms, encouraging people to download the Frog ID app and use the Frog ID app. I've been encouraging people to go out there and actually have a look at what sort of frog species are out there. And the queer and performing arts community are wild, and they embraced it like no tomorrow. And I have random strangers come up to me all the time and tell me about all these fun, interesting frog things, and it's insane, and I'm here for it. So thank you to that community. And then finally, David Scatting. This is a name and a face that I assume most people in this room are unfamiliar with. The one time I convinced this man to take a photo with me, he made me promise I would never show it to another person, which is why today I present to you an ominous floating brown hat. David is a botanist located in Gilgandra. He was my mentor straight out of my undergrad. And he took this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed animal enthusiast under his wing. He taught me all about native vegetation, taught me all about legislation and how to create and foster relationships with landholders. And he is the one that actually encouraged me to apply and go for my PhD, even if that meant abandoning him in Gilgandra. Since then, David really stepped up when I needed it the most. He was there when I lost my dad, when I lost my grandfather, when I lost my best friend, and when I lost my husband. He has been there through all my lockdowns and meltdowns, burnouts. He was there through the blue hair stage that we don't talk about. And he was there every single time I said I was going to quit. And he held my hand and told me absolutely not. He also would send me copious amounts of plants that I would no doubt kill. And he would remind me that you need to learn to kill a plant before you can keep it alive. He was my greatest support and genuinely the best dad that a little pink girl from the country could ask for. So thank you to the ominous floating brown hat. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle, very much for that presentation. Do we have opportunities for questions from the room or if anyone's on Zoom?
I'm very tired. Please be kind.
Oh, what's this? There you go.
Thank you. And thanks, Michelle. That was great. So I had questions about species interactions.
Yeah.
So two different questions. One is on the Gambusia. I'm curious, obviously you found some dams without Gambusia because you had a presence absence thing. So I guess the question is, how often do dams avoid getting Gambusia? And if so, can we say anything about, like, could we increase the chance of some dams not having Gambusia as part of a sort of a management thing?
Yeah.
And is there any evidence that there's an interaction between presence of Gambusia and some of the other environmental features in terms of response of frogs? Because I could, imagine that if there's more complex vegetation, then the ability for tadpoles to escape from some Gambusia or something might occur. So, and then the other one in a similar theme is simply whether or not you looked for interactions between frogs and frogs. So if you get a lot of one frog, given that you were focusing on largely common, the more common species, is there any evidence that some dams are sort of dominated by one species at the cost of others? And if so, that's another thing I suppose you could play to with whether or not you could create a different kind of diversity.
Yeah. So I'll start backwards with the frog question. We didn't look at interactions between species, purely because they're all common species. And my understanding is there's not a lot of negative interaction between those species, especially since being common species, they're pretty adaptable. They're pretty happy to do their own thing. We did see decreases in species. So for example, the banjo frog, our little muddy fellow that was up there, he essentially disappeared the whole time while we saw increases in other species. But I actually think that was a pesticide issue. Jody's work, I think, was because there were pesticides or it was some other issue. So it wasn't related to the other species. But I think that would be really interesting to look at, especially I did expect to see more species there in general. So I would be interested to see if these more common species were not out competing, but were maybe because the resources were so scarce,
suppose I was just imagining looking for correlations between species. You know,
Yeah.
are there some patterns that if
Yeah.
you look across species? Yeah.
It would be interesting to look at different types of water bodies, I think, or different types of dams. But I'm going to go with no.
Right.
Nice and simple. In regards to Gambusia, I could talk about Gambusia forever. I have a deep loathing for that species. Oh, what was the first question? Oh, whether or not, because we had presence absence.
Yeah.
So a lot of the dams where they were absent were actually closed systems. So it's very common for farm dams to be open systems. So for them to have some sort of other water body bringing water in, whether it's like another stream or something like that, or whether they're located somewhere in like at the bottom of a hill, so water would be running down. So that is a lot of the way that Gambusia will come into these systems. Additionally, they can be carried through birds. So a lot of the dams that we were finding that they weren't at were more isolated and closed systems. So it is definitely possible in some cases to have dams that don't have Gambusia. But for example, we have some beautiful, amazing dams in Junee. They're monsters, and the frogs and animals and bats and all that sort of stuff that they have there is phenomenal. However, there's no way we're ever going to get the Gambusia out of there because it's an entirely open system. And I believe that spreads across 3 different properties. It's just not possible for those. There has been research, I believe, looking into removing Gambusia via, I think it was a pathogen or some sort of chemical or something like that, but I don't think it was ever released because it was too dangerous to the other species around it. And in regards to how, like, other habitat types that were related to Gambusia and tadpoles, there has been research looking at tadpole interactions with Gambusia and finding that they are more successful at surviving. So tadpoles are more successful at surviving in habitats where there's more vegetation, so they can hide in that. Gambusia have quite small mouths, which is why they growth and development and that sort of stuff is hindered because the Gambusia are actually nibbling away at their tails and at the eggs. It's particularly of these small species. So the Crinia species that we found, they're very small species, so it makes sense that we had that interaction. And they're also the species that we found with tadpoles. I'd be interested to see what the interaction would be like with like banjo frogs, which are, you know, they're quite a chunky size tadpole. But yeah, if we could put in more like sedges and more aquatic vegetation that the tadpoles could hide in, I reckon we'd see quite a significant change in the interactions.
Thanks.
Yeah.
No, Jordan. I'll be kind. Thanks so much, Michelle. That was awesome. And yeah, yay frogs. My question was actually coming off the back of Gambusia stuff.
Yeah.
You said that you saw a size difference between the ponds that had Gambusia and didn't have Gambusia. You kind of answered it there, but were you looking at that at the same species? Like there was larger tadpoles present of the same species in the present ponds?
Yeah, it was at the species level.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. So because so we only saw Littoria peroni or Littoria. We only found 2 of those. So the other 2 species were sort of the Limnodynastes and the Crinia. We looked at those at a species level, and then combined it, but they're both relatively small. They're both relatively small tadpoles. But it would be, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that.
No,
yeah,
no, that's awesome.
together,
Yeah,
individually, both. The change was consistent.
yeah, cool, awesome, thanks.
Oh my God, thank you so much.
There's a online question. There are many farm dams that provide great habitat value for frogs without any deliberate enhancement by the landholder. Do you have any comments to make on how readily dams can be enhanced and whether or not actions to improve habitat value always work, and why some dams inherently provide good habitat?
Yeah, oh wow. Controversial potentially. I think it has a lot to do with the management in regards to livestock interactions. Unfortunately, livestock remove a lot of the habitat. So there are control dams that were wonderful. They had a great array of species and lots, you know, frogs there were abundant. They were technically control dams, but they were rotationally stocked with sheep. So the livestock was very rarely in there. However, on the same example or a similar example, just down the road, we had a really beautiful control dam that in 2020 was wonderful. And I saw these different frogs, and then the landholder put 60 head of stock in there and was a wasteland the next time I'd gone there. So I think in regards to dams that are, you know, not actively being enhanced, it's definitely possible to create one like great habitat and to just let them turn into habitat. This, you know, vegetation will regenerate on its own, and water quality, given the chance, will improve on its own. However, it will all come down at the end of the day to how it's managed, not just with livestock, but if they're in a paddock with, you know, that's getting cropped every year or every 6 months, however often you want to crop it, and you're putting pesticides into it, it'll be a great habitat for particular species, but not frogs. I think that's the question. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, great.
All right, we might do one final round of applause and done.